Most scientists agree that all human beings on the American continent were originally transplanted from the Eastern Hemisphere. This may or may not be true. It could have actually been the other way around. Someday, if we as a civilization last long enough, all ancient information will be revealed. The accepted explanation as of now has been that all the inhabitants of the Americas were descended from Asians who had crossed over the Bering Strait, which would have happened thousands of years ago before the Common Era. In 1829, the Book of Mormon said otherwise with Joseph Smith's theory, and it received considerable ridicule. His book described 3 separate groups who had made transoceanic crossings to the New World many centuries before Columbus. The book is primarily a family history book about the most prominent sons of a prophet named Lehi. He led one of the groups. One of his sons was named Nephi, and their culture is collectively known as the Nephites. Their history spans over 1,000 years, from 600 BC to about 450 AD, and occupies most of the Book of Mormon. Today, the idea of a transoceanic crossings to America is hotly debated. While the majority opinion still resides with the Bering Strait land bridge theory, more and more findings are pointing to many transoceanic crossings. Many different cultures, from several different continents, being here long before 1492. We find archaeological evidence from what would appear to be Asian, European, Mideastern and African cultures in our dug-up artifacts. Our current society has a major problem understanding how people traveled and traded thousands of years before the rediscovery of the New World. The Book of Mormon also introduces us to a much earlier culture known as the Jaredites, who left Babylonia sometime between the 19th and 20th centuries BC. According to the book, it was in the time of the confounding of languages during the Tower of Babel episode. Scholars have compared the Mormon Jaredites to the North American Archaic and Adina cultures, who were a Pre-Columbian Native American culture. They lived mostly in present-day Ohio. They have also been identified with the Olmec peoples inhabiting places around the Gulf of Mexico. They probably became the first Mesoamerica civilization. Evidence found of these two cultures show they could possibly be one and the same peoples. They are also associated with the ancient mound-building culture remains found over the past several hundred years all over America. As time passes, things continue to be found from the stories of Mr. Smith. They don't seem to be so wild after all. Because most of his book covers text regarding the Jaredite people, little has been written about them in comparison to the Nephites. However, it is apparent that the Jaredite culture had a great influence on the later Nephite culture. History tells us that King Zedekiah of Jerusalem had all his sons murdered in front of him, and then he was blinded from the conquering Babylonians. The implied account tells us that he had one son who escaped. The escaping son's name was Mulek and was probably an infant, or perhaps in the womb, when, with some kind of entourage, left Jerusalem and arrived in Mesoamerica. Also, at approximately the same time Lehi's group arrived. This was approximately 600 BC. This group is mentioned in the Book of Mormon only to briefly introduce the origins of a people living in a land. Their city was named after their king Zarahemla, who accepted the Nephites about 300 BC after they had fled their homeland, the city of Nephi. No one is sure what this group called themselves. They were unnamed in the book, but most researchers refer to them as the Mulekites. There are things that would suggest that many of the Mulekites were Canaanitic Phoenicians. You can read in the Bible that the kings of Israel had political and friendship ties with the kings of Sidon and Tyre. Solomon made an alliance with King Hiram of Tyre, who supplied materials for Solomon's temple. You also find the name Hiram Abif mentioned in the Bible as the principal worker in the building of Solomon's temple. Hiram Abif is also found at the core of Freemasonic ritual. Hiram's father is said to have been a Phoenician, and his mother was an Israelite. Why is this significant? Because stated in the Book of Mormon, in the middle of Nephite territory, in the land of Zarahemla, it was originally populated by the Mulegites. And we find a Phoenician place name, Sidon, a name of one of the Phoenician major cities. Why would Jews name the principal river in their territory after a Phoenician capital unless they had Phoenician influence among them? Most likely the Phoenicians were the only people that had the ships and the know-how to make the transatlantic voyage. The Bible's Old Testament refers to Canaanites when referring to the early Phoenicians who inhabited the eastern Mediterranean coast. What we know of them from ancient times was mostly recorded by Greek and Roman historians who mentioned their seamanship and shrewd business acumen. Phoenicians dominated the Mediterranean sea travel, trade and commerce for over 2,000 years. Masters of the art of navigation, Phoenician ships were made from the cedars of Lebanon and they ruled the seas. They were the first people to sail past the Pillars of Hercules and discover the vast Atlantic Ocean. They had discovered the North Star, which the Greeks named the Phoenician Star in their honor. The Phoenicians made important contributions to the marine sciences, having been credited with the division of a circle into 360 degrees and having reliable celestial reference points. By 1000 BC, the seafaring Phoenicians, the greatest traders of their time, were moving beyond the Strait of Gibraltar to trade. The Phoenicians, as we find, even ventured across the Atlantic to the Americas. Phoenician inscriptions found in Brazil point to the fact that the Phoenicians crossed the Atlantic thousands of years before Columbus. Items the Phoenicians exported were cedar, pine, fine linen, embroideries, metalwork, glass, wine, salt and dried fish. They imported papyrus for paper, ivory, ebony, silk, amber, ostrich eggs, spices, incense, horses, gold, silver, copper, iron, tin, cocaine, tobacco, cannabis, and jewels. The craft of glass making was raised to a fine art by Phoenician artisans. They may have been the first to develop blown glass. Cedar was especially important in the ancient Middle East, which had little wood. The fragrant cedars of Lebanon were much prized. The Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun had furniture in his tomb made of Phoenician cedar. Ancient Phoenicia also produced the rare purple dye that came from a special snail. Purple became the color of royalty. The master craftsman Hiram of Tyre was commissioned to build and embellish the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Phoenicia provided the cedar wood and its craftsmen, known as the Freemasons, as they were not the property of any king, who did the actual construction. They were also called on to decorate many palaces throughout Mesopotamia. Needing some way to keep track of their commerce, the Phoenicians developed an alphabet, which the Greeks later adapted for their language and in some ways shaped the English alphabet. Phoenicia ended with the fall of Tyre to the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar in 573 BC. Now back to the Book of Mormon. It has been proposed that a few aristocratic and elite Jews whisked away the son of Zedekiah, the lone survivor of the royal family. And they took him, fleeing to Phoenicia, and then they made their way to America with Phoenicians on Phoenician ships. It appears likely that a good number of the Mulegites were Phoenicians by blood. What better reason for the Mulegites' language to have been corrupted so much, as written, when many of the people weren't Jews, but were Canaanites from Phoenicia, and spoke other Canaanitic dialects. In the ancient Levant, the Phoenicians were the only ones to have the knowledge of the Americas. They kept the knowledge secret to themselves for a place where they could flee. As shown from the ancient records of the ancient Greek historian Diodorus from 56 BC. Who else was fleeing from the Babylonians besides the Phoenicians? Of course, their allies, the Jewish aristocracy and elites. Writings tell the story. Diodorus relates that there are islands which are in the ocean, and one in particular of considerable size lies quite a distance from Libya or Africa. It is a long voyage of a number of days to the west. He says the land is fruitful and beautiful. Much of it is mountainous and it has navigable rivers which are used for irrigation. It has private villas of costly construction and banqueting houses and inhabitants. He goes on and on and on in his description of this land to the west of Africa. He seems to have quite a bit of knowledge about it, and there is no doubt that he is describing the place we now call America. This was long before the time of Columbus. He relates that it remained undiscovered because of its distance from the entire inhabited world. But the Phoenicians had discovered it accidentally. He mentions the fact that they planted many colonies throughout Libya as well in the western parts of Europe. And he says they ventured out beyond the Pillars of Heracles into the sea. Then, as they were in the Atlantic Ocean, they were driven by strong winds a great distance out into the sea. They were storm-tossed for many days. Finally, they arrived ashore to this island and had observed its felicity. He claims that Carthage didn't want to colonize this area in order to have ready a place in which to seek refuge against an incalculable turn of fortune. Just in case some total disaster should overtake Carthage. Because they figured that they would be able to move quickly to a place that was unknown to their conquerors. It is precisely this logic that ties the Phoenicians to Moloch. It was they alone who could provide precisely what Moloch and the fleeing Jews needed. They needed a place to go that was unknown to those who were seeking after them. This would help explain how the Mulegites made their way to America with knowledge of copper smelting and the know-how to expand their ancient trade network. Many valuable products were exported and imported from and into the Americas over the centuries prior to our Dark Ages. This is when many generations simply forgot their own past and reverted into wandering tribes. The wheel is still turning, we'll know everything someday. That is, if something doesn't happen to make us forget first.